Hi, this is Merrina again. Welcome back to reading Mountains Beyond Mountains with me. We had talked about chapter 10 and 11 last time, which I believe were about a lot of um, civil unrest in Haiti and how Dr. Farmer was involved in it while building his own free hospital. Today we'll start with chapter 12. Ophelia visited Cange during the time of the junta in the early 1990s. She slept in the main dormitory over the communal kitchen. One morning, when she came down to breakfast, Paul said, rather casually, that someone had stood outside his window last night, striking matches. She'd often felt nervous in Haiti in the turbulent years after the Duvaliers was thrown out. This was worse. When they ran into soldiers at checkpoints and roadblocks, Paul wasn't even civil to them. He would not take down the iron sculpture that hung in his room of the clinic, the aristocrat symbol of Coq Khalid, the fighting quality cock. So this is the person who was elected president but was taken down by the militia, and Dr. Farmer still supports the elected guy who was supposedly supporting liberation theology. He would leave his books about the Che Guevara and Castro and the like unhidden. She thought it would be dreadful if they came and searched the place. She lay in bed at night, listening to the dogs barking and the roosters crowing and the drums beating in the hills. One evening she awakened as headlights swept through the lowered windows of her room. The next morning, people said that soldiers had been poking around Zemi La Sante last night. She thought, the Plateau Central is the home of the resistance, so there is no way to get out of here except that road, and everyone knows that this place is full of Astride supporters. She asked the woman in charge of the kitchen. She was known as Iron Pants, a generic Haitian nickname for a tough woman. What if they came in to massacre us? Iron Pants said. We will defend this place with our lives. Ophelia thought, with what? Our pots and pans and Cooligan water cooler? Paul continued to make edgy transit between Cange and Boston. Indeed, he made it edgier. He asked Tom White to give him $10,000 in cash, which he managed to smuggle into Haiti and turn over to the underground pacifist resistance. In the car, driving back with the money from Tom's house on Cape Cod, Jim Kim said to Paul, you are not used to anyone as a martyr. He tried to soften his tone. If you get yourself killed, pal, I'm going to kill you. Paul's face turned bright red. What do you want me to do? Paul had yelled at him before, but Jim had never heard him scream. Paul smuggled the money into Haiti. Safely back in Boston, Ophelia fretted about him in Cange. He was so angry he might do anything, she thought. What if a soldier came into Zemi La Sante and tried to arrest one of his patients? Oh, God! He seemed to be growing more and more reckless. He invited some nuns from the Catholic group Pax Christi to Haiti, hoping they'd help advertise the junta's depredations. Twice at roadblocks, soldiers searched both him and the nuns. One time, the soldiers ordered him to get out of the jeep and say, "Long live the Haitian army." I am not going to say that. Oh, you better say that. They lifted their weapons. Okay, he said swiftly. In Cange, he slept in his clothes with his shoes on. His room was adjacent to a piece of thickly planted ground, reforested by him. He imagined what he'd do if the soldiers arrived. Jump off the window and hide among the vines and trees from the beams of their flashlights. This was not this was morally acceptable, he thought, because they will be coming for me. Then one day a lone soldier started to enter Zemillasante carrying a gun. Farmer came out to the courtyard. As always, a crowd waited there. You can't bring a gun in here, Farmer said to the soldier. Who are you to tell me what I can do? I am the person who is going to take care of you when you are sick, Farmer answered. He was feeling mildly amused until the crowd behind him heard he heard a voice say "ket" in rough translation. Oh, shoot. It had the sound of someone anticipating disaster. Farmer thought, oh God, I misjudged the situation. The crowd suddenly seemed like a liability. The soldier couldn't back down in front of them without losing face, but his answer to the soldier was probably the right one, and probably contained the main reason that he wasn't banished or worse during those years. In fact, he was the best doctor in the Central Plateau, and Zemillasante was the only place where anyone, including soldiers and their families, could get good medical treatment. The soldier growled some menacing words, then left. Farmer's patient friends and colleagues scolded him. After that, he curtailed his travel. Shots had been fired at Zemillassante's office in Port-au-Prince, where Pierre Lafontaine had decided to close it. Farmer stayed out of the city except when catching planes back to Boston. He received his MacArthur grant in the summer of 1993, when it seemed that the junta might always be in power. He went to the award ceremony in Chicago, but soon afterward went back to his hotel room, hiding, as he thought of it, and watching the news from Haiti on TV. He was sitting in his room feeling wretched, thinking, big deal, I just got a MacArthur. Oh great, my stars ascending, as the Haitians said. When he heard voices outside, Haitians, of course, who was more likely to be cleaning hotels in the States, he went out and chatted with them, which cheered him up a little bit. In Haiti, the body count kept growing. 3 close friends of Farmer's had been murdered. He asked Ophelia to give him some money, and he went to Quebec City, his favorite of all cities. He'd always loved snow. In 10 days in a hotel room, he wrote 220 pages, most of the draft of the book that he would eventually call The Uses of Haiti. It is, I think, the best of Farmer's books, certainly the most passionate, essentially a history of American policy toward Haiti. The history, that is, as if written in collaboration with a Haitian farmer. The perspective is interesting. One learns, for instance, that United States tried to help the French put down the Haitian Revolution in 1790s during the time of American slavery, refused to recognize Haiti, and practiced gunboat diplomacy there. Also that during the American occupation, the U.S. Congress had reconstituted the modern Haiti Army and helped to finance it right up until the time when it deposed Arstride, that the head of the junta's death squads, whose minions had murdered Chocho, had been trained at Fort Benning's School of the Americas, that some of the junta's henchmen and officers in the Haitian army also worked for the CIA, that while formally deploring the coup, Washington, with the help of a generally compliant mainstream American press, was busily denouncing Arstride, even manufacturing lies about him, and maintaining a leaky embargo that seemed calculated to preserve appearances but not to drive the junta out of power. In the book, a number of heroes don't look so fine. The French revolutionaries, whose idea of fraternity didn't include the slaves in Saint-Domingue, and the Haitian mulattoes who went to France to aid those revolutionaries, in the hope that they could win the right to own slaves themselves. Woodrow Wilson, who presided over the American invasion of Haiti, even FDR, who once boasted that, while serving as Assistant Secretary to the Navy, had written the Haitian Constitution of 1918. There were others on the list whom Farmer often mentioned elsewhere. The former American slave and great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who eagerly served as an American ambassador to Haiti, in effect representing the Monroe Doctrine there, and Mother Teresa, who came to Haiti in 1981 during the time of Baby Doc, and, as one historian put it, gushed over the profligate dictator and his widely hated wife Michelle, who had looted millions from the Haitian treasury for her worldwide shopping sprees. Mother Teresa said Michelle had taught her a lesson in humility and marveled at the closeness of the First Lady to her people. In the United States, there was talk that the new Clinton administration might send troops to put Astride back into power, albeit with conditions, such as accepting plans for structural economic adjustment. In early 1994, just before the use of Haiti came out, Farmer wrote another editorial for the Miami Herald. The gist of it was, should the U.S. military intervene in Haiti? We already have. Now we should do so in a new way to restore democracy. The editorial was mentioned in Haiti on government radio. Farmer was said to have slandered the Haitian government. Soldiers came looking for him to escort him out of the country. But he was already in Boston. Farmer was officially expelled again, but this time with a finality that even bribery couldn't undo. I would have expelled me too, if I were them. He mopped around the PIH office. Ophelia bought him a guitar, and he actually took some lessons, until the news came that yet another friend had been assassinated in Haiti. Jim half carried Farmer home, weeping and puking from a bar that night. The next day, Farmer gave away his guitar. For the rest of the summer of 1994, he lectured about the situation in Haiti to anyone who would listen, in small towns in Maine and Texas, Kansas and Iowa, usually staying at the houses of church ladies. He testified before a congressional committee along with some nuns, but most of the congressmen were asleep. He debated an American general. I basically just let it rip, he said later. The Haitian situation is not understandable unless you know that the U.S. created the Haitian army, blah blah blah, infectious disease. The general's main response was to yell at him, Paul, you are totally out in left field. Most of the sources Farmer used in his book were American government documents. He had imagined that he could merely say he was a doctor and had written about things he had either seen with his own eyes or had looked up, and he'd be believed. He was well received in some quarters, but usually not on the radio. During a show in Fort Lauderdale, a caller said, referring to the boatloads of refugees who were fleeing the poverty and violence in Haiti and trying to get to Florida, we can't have Haitians coming into our country. Why not? Farmer said. My family are boat people. The host, understandably, didn't get it. Dr. Farmer, are you Haitian? Several times, and especially after the general yelled at him, he thought, screw this, I want to go back to my clinic. He returned the day after Astride was reinstated as president in mid-October 1994. So that was a lot of information to summarize. The political situation in Haiti wasn't very good in the late 1990s, and Dr. Farmer, being an American physician, was very active in trying to help with the situation, and I'm very surprised that he is so brave and so determined to do what is right in his heart. The 3 years of military rule in Haiti had resembled a war, and like every war, produced a public health disaster. The United Nations is estimated that about 8,000 people got killed, most of them murdered by the Haitian army and its paramilitaries. Many boat people, perhaps thousands, drowned while trying to get away, and more died than on the Titanic when a leaky old ferry named Neptune had sunk. But deaths from drowning and gunshots and torture probably made up just a fraction of the total. There was no telling precisely how much public health had deteriorated by the time military rule ended, but Farmer could make some guesses based on the wreckage he returned to in Cage. Somehow, Pierre Lafontaine had managed to get the new hospital built, but all Zami Lasante's projects in the village around Cage had been interrupted. Its program for women's literacy, for vaccinating children, for sanitation and clean water, for distribution of condoms and other AIDS prevention measures. Partners in Health had financed a movie about HIV. Patients created the script, which depicted a truck driver and a soldier romancing several female victims. It was being shown to a crowd in a village school when soldiers walked in and shut down the projector. Not the wisest thing during the reign of a military junta to show a movie that blames AIDS on soldiers. Zami Lasante had put the movie away for the duration. In the region, only Zami Lasante had dared to treat people who had been beaten or shot. The army had shut down the clinic once, briefly. The place was marked, afraid to be seen there, afraid to travel at all, lest they end up like Chocho. Many patients hadn't come until they'd grow very ill. Many had stayed away. The number of patients fell by half during those years, yet the clinic recorded an annual doubling of injuries from assaults, including 4 rapes committed by soldiers, a large increase in typhoid, and 22 times more cases of measles than average before the coup. The years of military rule had exacerbated the chronic malnutrition, and tuberculosis had risen markedly in the region. The junta had focused most of its terror on the urban slums, because some of Astride's most ardent support was concentrated in them, and the slums were also at the center of Haiti's AIDS epidemic. Hundreds of thousands fled back to the countryside. At Ziamilosante in 1993, the number of patients with AIDS had increased by about 60%. Several of the staff had resigned in fear. Farmer wrote that paralysis and lassitude afflicted almost all of medical personnel who stayed on. They missed meetings or canceled them, abandoned research, found excuses for not resuming the interrupted projects. Haitian doctors, he had long ago discovered, learned early to accept all sorts of deficiencies, shortage of medicine, filthy hospitals. Perhaps it is a universal tendency to view the deaths of strangers philosophically. Haitian doctors had better cause for this than failing them most others in medicine. Not surprisingly, they tended to shrug when patients died from ailments like measles or tetanus or TB. Farmer had put some of his best efforts into teaching his staff to expect more of themselves. Now, many were shrugging again. But the situation was far from hopeless, and he was glad to be back. Farmer was 35 now, on the rise in both medicine and anthropology. He had won his MacArthur. He was an infectious disease fellow in training at one of the world's best teaching hospitals, an assistant professor in medical anthropology in Harvard, and the author of 2 books and 24 articles. He seemed to have looked forward to a great deal more of the same, and he seems to have imagined that his main job now, and PIH's as well, was to repair Zemi Lasante and keep expanding it. Partners in Health had changed their office twice since 1987. They had finally acquired their own small headquarters building in Cambridge. The idea had been Jim Kim's, the money Tom White's. The staff there numbered only about a dozen, a little less than half volunteers, the rest unpaid employees. They managed an AIDS prevention program for Haitian teenagers in Boston, in the rundown neighborhood right next to Brigham, a program for providing medical and social services to people who weren't getting any. They supported, with small sums and advice, a few public health projects in far-flung places, such as Chiapas in Mexico, and their research branch, dedicated to criticizing the status quo in international health, was assembling a book about the special worldwide vulnerability of impoverished women to AIDS. Women, Poverty, and AIDS, it was called. Hearing the title, a friend of Farmer's said, "That's what I like about your books, Paul. They have such cheerful subjects." One could hardly have called PIH Paul's Catholic Church anymore, but for all their cosmopolitan outlook, they were still just a small public charity with a substantial medical complex in Haiti, and Farmer seemed to have felt they were going to stay that way. In PIH's 1993 annual report, he had written that they should never change their mission or soften their message in order to broaden their appeal. Accordingly, he wrote, they should resign themselves to a somewhat marginal status. But in fact, a big change in PIH was about to begin. They were about to become players in international health. Okay, so now it is part 3, Medical Adventures, and in chapter 13. A simple epidemiology map, a map based on what makes people sick and what kills them, and in what numbers and at what age, could be coded in 2 colors. One would stand for populations who tend to die in their 70s, mainly from illnesses that seemed like inevitable accompaniments to the aging of bodies. The other color would stand for groups who, on the average, die 10 or even 40 years earlier, often from violence and hunger and infectious disease that medical science knows how to prevent and treat, if not always to cure. On this map, the line dividing the 2 color-coded parts of humanity, what Farmer called the Great Epi-Divide, would partition many countries, many cities. Most of Haiti would wear the color of ill health, but parts of the hill above Port-au-Prince would be a patch of well-being. The map of the United States, by contrast, would depict a healthy nation speckled with disease. In Boston's Mission Hill neighborhood, right next to Brigham, for instance, infant mortality is higher than in Cuba. In New York's Harlem, a famous study from 1990 showed death rates for males between the age of 5 and 65 were higher than in Bangladesh. Wow, that's very surprising to learn. I wonder why men are much more likely to die in New York City than in Bangladesh. It's probably very complicated. There are like socioeconomic factors and other things that could cause this. Major incomes don't guarantee abysmal health statistics, but the two usually go together. Many of the groups of people living on the wrong side of the Great Epi-Divide have brown or black skin. Many are female. What they all have in common is Poverty. Absolute poverty. The lack of almost every necessity, clean water and shoes, medicine and food. In a place like Haiti, relative poverty in a place like New York. For Farmer and Jim Kim and many others interested in distribution of disease, tuberculosis vividly illustrated the Great Epi-Divide, its contours, its causes, its effects. Improperly treated, or not treated at all, TB is dreadful and lethal, usually devouring the lungs, but also sometimes other organs, and sometimes the bones. Fortunately, an array of good and inexpensive first-line TB drugs existed. They had to be administered over the course of months, thanks in part to those antibiotics. Usually 8 to 6 weeks, and they will be cured. Tuberculosis have all but vanished from the rich parts of the world, but the disease still plagued the poor parts to a degree most Americans and many Western Europeans would find hard to credit. At the end of the 20th century, TB was killing about 2 million people a year, more adults than any other infectious disease, except for AIDS. And TB shared what Farmer called a noxious synergy with AIDS, since an active case of one often makes a latent case of the other active too. In poor countries, TB was the most common proximate cause of death among people who died with AIDS, and yet, because TB mainly afflicted the poor side of the Epi-Divide, the industrial nations and pharmaceutical companies had all but abandoned the search for new technologies to fight it. The tools for diagnosing the disease was antique. No large campaign had been launched to find a fully effective vaccine, and the newest of the anti-TB drugs had been developed 25 years ago. Farmer liked to say that TB made its own preferential option for the poor. Aphorism contained a certain literal truth. According to the best current estimates, about 2 billion people, 1/3 of humanity, had TB bacilli in their bodies, but the disease tends to remain latent. It multiplies into bone-eating, lung-consuming illnesses in only about 10% of those affected. The likelihood of getting sick increases greatly, though, for those suffering from malnutrition or various disease, such as HIV. Itself is by now dominantly a disease associated with poverty. Usually, active TB feeds on the lungs and spread itself for them. Sneeze and coughs like the wind to the seeds. People who live in crowded peasant huts and urban slums and shanty towns and prisons and homeless shelters stand the best chance of inhaling the bacilli, having their infections expand into active disease, and in some settings of getting just enough treatment to make their TB drug resistant. A person with active TB of the lungs harbor hundreds of millions of bacteria, enough to ensure that a small number will be mutant, impervious to anti-TB drugs. In a patient who gets only one antibiotic or inadequate doses of several, or who takes the medicine erratically or for too short a time, the drug-susceptible bacilli may die off, while the drug-resistant mutants flourish. The patient becomes a site of rapid bacterial evolution, with drugs supplying the selective pressure. In the gravest cases, patients end up infected with bacilli that can't be killed by the two most powerful drugs. Medical science reserves a special name for tuberculosis of that sort, multi-drug resistant TB, or MDR by abbreviation. It is a scary disease and a serious problem wherever it appears, but worst, of course, in the places with the fewest resources to deal with it. Multi-drug-resistant TB tend to arise where wealth and poverty are mingled, where poor people can get some treatment, but not enough. It arises only infrequently in places of nearly universal poverty like Haiti, where most people don't get treated at all. But by the mid-1990s, Farmer had dealt with several cases of MDR in Canje. The first had appeared during the time of the junta. He remembered the feeling of dread that washed over him when he realized what his patient had, and dread was justified. The young man died. Farmer blamed himself, but the fact was that treating MDR was tricky under the best of circumstances, and for a while, during the time of the junta, he simply couldn't get the necessary medicine to Canje. Since the death of that patient, he had assembled resources to fight the disease at Zamni-Lasante, both the tools and the procedures. He was curing most of the cases that appeared sporadically in Canje, where in 1995, MDR claimed a close friend who had been living in a shanty town on the outskirts of Lima, Peru. And that's the end of chapter 13. In summary, it is found that horrible infectious diseases like HIV and tuberculosis are heavily concentrated at places where poverty is at its worst. So this is what Dr. Farmer is going to try to tackle in Haiti, and we'll find out what he does in our future chapters. Thanks for being with me, and I'll see you next time. Bye!